Hello, everyone. This is Thierry RUIZ here, your host for this webinar and fireside chat about the financial future we want. In this case, we will speak particularly about the economy post-COVID-19 with the people that you already know as you are logging in. I will go through. So I am Thierry RUIZ. I will be taking the hat of the Bastiat Society Switzerland and the American Institute for Economic Research to moderate this panel with Gary Gertler, who is the CEO of IWG Switzerland. Those are flexible workspaces all over Switzerland, but also all over the planet. Aleksander Berentsen, the professor of business and economics at the University of Basel. He's also the author of Bitcoin, blockchain, and cryptoassets, a comprehensive introduction. It's published by the MIT Press, and we will probably share the links below at a later stage. We also have with us Kristina Touzenis, who has more than 20 years of multilateral relations experience and is now advising public and private sector. Just as a disclaimer, as we are starting this conversation, the dialogue and this webinar is for entertainment purposes only, and the sentences that can be said by different people only represent their own opinion and not necessarily the organization for which they have a role. As a first statement, perhaps, I want to say thank you to all of the speakers for being here. I'm very proud to have gathered such an excellent panel. We will be speaking about the economy post-COVID. This assumes that there was an economy before COVID-19, and then there is an economy going forward after COVID-19. I think a lot of people see this event as a milestone that will really be remembered in history, a little bit like 9/11 in certain aspects. This is also another tragedy, but there is hope and there is transformation, and there might be pockets of crisis, but there is probably also a lot of opportunities. So I think overall this conversation will be about different sectors, different approaches, and also where we can take some of these opportunities moving forward. So to start, I would like to give the floor to Kristina and then subsequently to all of the other panelists. And tell us in one or two sentences, what do you think globally about what the economy post-COVID-19 will look like?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Secondly, thank you so much for putting me on the spot and putting me first. Just a little caveat. I think I might be the only non-economist on the panel. I'm an international lawyer. As you said, I've spent most of my career in the multilateral sector with being heading up the international law sector in the International Organization for Migration. And I jumped out last year. So I am sort of coming from a different perspective. What I see is that there has been so much activity and so much going on sustainable finance, on what does it actually mean to have a sustainability strategy in place that, for instance, looks at the human rights of people in a supply chain, the effects that dealings that you have either with your investee or that the company has with its surrounding societies, what impact is it? And I see more and more interest in actually not only having a nice sort of like statement, we work towards the SDGs, or oh, we are ESG compliant, but really more about what is it that we're actually doing. And I think that COVID brought a focus on the societal and also on internal governance that perhaps wasn't there before.
Aleksander?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. So the future that I want, in finance hasn't changed. So COVID has not affected what I want. I want permissionless systems where everybody has access, equal footing access to financial products. The system today is very restrictive. You have to be rich already to have access to lucrative investments, and that should change. And the future is going to be permissionless and open source. Just an example would be Ethereum or Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies.
Thank you. Gary, what do you think is going to happen post-COVID?
So prior to COVID, the real estate sector and developments in the real estate sectors have been driven by digital projects, have been driven by a real focus of companies trying to put new community governments into place and to reorganize their organizations to apply much more flexible models, hybrid models into their business model. Now after COVID, we clearly see that this trend is going on. What COVID has been doing or creating is a much more urgency on the theme. So there is more focus on it, there is more concentration on it. And I think one of the key learnings out of COVID for most of the organization was that organization that have been restricted in allowing hybrid models for their employees, that they have not lost productivity or very low productivity during the COVID time. And this has engaged them to push projects much faster and with much more focus forward. And there we see a faster change that is happening in the real estate industry.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. The transformation of the economy seemed to be already on the go, but COVID seemed to have just accelerated that. And it's joining the point of Aleksander, who was saying that it doesn't change much, but there is a trend, and then this event has kind of like you said, Gary, accelerated the urgency factor of people. But I think also the differences between the haves and have-nots, I think, is also somewhat accelerated. So, Aleksander, how do you see the macroeconomic, forecast when it comes to central banking actions, fiscal actions, and then what repercussions those can have overall in the economy, and maybe after Kristina can also tell us about the disparity of wealth. So Aleksander, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the micro level. The micro level, household firms, of course, there's a lot of changes. Everybody experienced that, the way they work is different and stuff like this. But from the macro level, I think we are going to be left with two changes. One will be debt levels, which will be much higher. And then also, I mean, you mentioned that several times, just kind of printing money, or the balance sheet of central banks that just exploded. That already started 10 years ago or 15 years ago in 2008 as a reaction to the financial crisis. And in the meantime, we had movements like the modern money theory. You might have heard about MMT, actually became very popular in the US. They basically claim if you have your own currency, if you can print your own currency, government deficit don't matter. And that's why I believe that even without COVID, this path to just spend more or to increase your government deficit would have happened anyway. Maybe it's also accelerated now, but it seems to be so attractive from the point of view of a politician, right? You can just spend and spend and spend, and the repercussions. He is not going to feel the repercussions because they are going to be in the future. So that's why I think even in this matter, COVID has accelerated, but that didn't really change anything.
So
what is going to happen, we will see. I mean, it's very hard to see. And Japan is living with a high deficit for decades. Italy too. I mean, it might just blow up sometime, but we don't know. There's so little knowledge about it.
So you know, a lot of Austrian economists would say that they wouldn't care so much about the intention as much as they would care about the results. Because even though there is some political actions, and then there's also an attempt to solve that problem, it could be that the result of those actions might not be the ones expected. And when I'm thinking as a libertarian here, when I say, is it COVID who forced businesses to close, or is it politicians who forced businesses to close? And then what the unintended consequences of those are. And here I particularly want to pass the microphone to Kristina to tell us about what COVID has changed in terms of how we approach problems as an individual, as a society, but then also the impact it has had on the disparity of wealth and what we could do about it. Kristina, maybe you can comment.
Yeah, I think I also really wanted to go back to what you said about the change, or the difference between the have and have nots. I think what COVID has done is perhaps to shine a light on these issues, specifically for people who before didn't really know or notice. I mean, I think it really showed how societies who, for instance, do not guarantee living wages, who do not guarantee paid sick leave, are actually exposed much more than societies that are to the effects of a pandemic. Because if you don't feel comfortable, or you simply, I mean, feel uncomfortable is an euphemism, if you're not able to actually survive, if you don't go to work because you're paid per hour and you're paid a very, very low salary per hour, and if you're not there, you're not paid, you go to work coughing on rich people's food, and that's very uncomfortable for the rich people. I mean, let's face it, right? And I think that it's sort of like perhaps made some people realize what it means when you have people who just do not benefit from the rights that they legally should benefit from, because they are like everybody else as a living wage. And that also goes to Social Security. For instance, if you lose your job, the idea with Social Security is that you don't go below the poverty line, because at that point it's so much harder to build yourself up again, but that you sort of remain at a level where you can actually yourself then have the capacity and the energy to go and look for a job when things become better, and you remain a productive individual in the society. And my hope is, I don't know if this is going to last, but my hope is that there is an awareness now that letting people fall through gaps, not respecting everybody's rights so that you have marginalized or you create marginalization, is not good for anybody. I realize that for the super rich, it probably does not make a huge amount of difference, but it might start making a difference when the super rich need to invest their mini money, and that regulation is being more and more stringent also on how do you treat people in your supply chain, how do you do your human rights due diligence, what does your international or internal governance system actually look like if something has happened? How do you create or ensure redress if you have caused harm? And I think there's a new attention towards these things in sectors where before you did not have any knowledge about this at all. One danger that I see is that, I mean, sustainability firms, ESG funds pop up a dime a dozen these days. And when I go and look at who's actually responsible, it's very rare that you have somebody in the team who has true technical sustainability experience. You very often have people who've been doing investment for 25 years and they will know everything about return on investment. But if you really want to speak about what do you have to look at to, for instance, have multi-stakeholder engagement, to have a rights-based approach so that you actually ensure that people have their rights respected, as well as, you know, carbon footprint, of which I would know absolutely nothing. It's a technical competence. And I think there's a real danger if we don't really cross-fertilize that sort of expertise and have everybody speaking SDG or everybody speaking sustainability, because it's something very specific and we can risk really harming people if we don't respect that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us understand that there's a lot of things to be done, and there will be transformations. I think a lot of our audience is probably interested in what the opportunities are and what those transformations are. So maybe Gary, you can comment on what is the future of work or the future of the economy when it comes to you know, the decentralization and what are the benefits that one can have as they see that the way we work is being transformed from working from home, but also maybe working remotely, simply speaking, from anywhere else, and then perhaps also benefiting other countries where you know, there is cheaper labor but just as much brains, I would say.
Okay, thanks for your question again. So from a real estate point of view and the opportunity how people are going to work in future, the trends we see that get, really go into what we call as a hybrid model. What does hybrid model really mean? Is that organizations give the people the possibility to work from wherever they want. So they will spend some time in the headquarters. The headquarters probably are going on a long-term basis, are going to change and will become much more a place where you meet, where you exchange ideas, where you live your social life in the company, and much less a place where you go to an office and work in an office, because this work can be done anywhere. And organizations that allow this change, they will become much more attractive for talents. And one of the key components for companies to be successful is to have the right talents on board. So I think it's a key thing that most of the big and most of the organizations have understood, and they're working towards implementing these policies. And it's an individual, it must be a policy that is designed for your own organization. It depends how old are your age groups, what are the desires and what are the needs of these age groups, and. The second thing is major change what will happen as soon as you implement this hybrid workforce. It will reduce commuting to a big extent, which has obviously huge benefits for the employee himself. He can manage his own time. He can improve his work-life balance. And last but not least, he has a much less carbon footprint if he reduces his commuting. And if you multiply this by total workforce in the world and how many people can be affected by this, there are major opportunities to drive things in the right direction. And there probably is one last element. Today, organizations plan and supply office space for the maximum number of employees. In today, or in the past, there was the thinking, I need to have a workplace for each of my employees. Going through offices and looking how much of these workspaces are really used, most organizations will find that it's about 50 people that are constantly occupying offices because they're on holidays, they're with customers, they are working hybrid. So there is a major and workplace depending, let's say in Switzerland, for a professional organization, the workplace cost is about 12,000 Swiss francs a year. So if you can reduce the number of workspaces you have in your organization because you can outsource it and you can give it to different organizations and places to work, it's a major cost reduction. So, and this will increase the efficiency. So all these benefits have been shown are developments that, as I said before, have been there here, but have been accelerated in through COVID.
Yeah, I mean, in full transparency, I mean, I myself, I use Spaces, which is part of the IWG group, and I think one of the things we found is that it opens the perspective not only from the, I'm talking as an entrepreneur now, because I can find offices everywhere I go, even when I myself am on the move, but it also opens the perspective into how am I going to plan expansion in other markets, and finding an office space or a meeting point there, it's pretty interesting. But then this brings me to the conversation we had last time with Aleksander, where there was a clash between the deflationary pressures and the inflationary pressures. And one of the deflationary factors was the fact that there was a global competitiveness in the labor force. And so the labor force, as it is competitive all around the world, and you now have, through solutions like yours, Gary, the opportunity of tapping into those talents, like you say, and for cheaper, this brings wages overall low. I mean, we know in Switzerland wages are very expensive, but when I'm looking at Mexico as a market opportunity, I can see talent there, I can see expansion there. And so joining that conversation, Aleksander, maybe you can comment between those deflationary macro pressures that could come from labor or productivity, and this inflationary push from central banks and from government spending, which one of the two you think is going to win?
Well, let me just say something more personally from my experience. So you see my very nice background here. That's where I stayed more or less during COVID. I recorded my lectures and I just sent them in. For me, it's perfect. But if I were like 30 years old, the prospective professor, I would be really worried. Because if this is the way that we are going to teach, why not just take the best? You know, why hire professors? You know, just take, you know, there's the standard courses, Economics 101. They're really good professors. They really know how to teach. You just take their slides or whatever their records, and you ask your students to look at that. So that's the aspect you had, right? The competition. Now we have suddenly worldwide competition. And in fact, we are not needed, at least not for teaching. Of course, we do some other stuff like research. So that's the deflationary pressure, which will, I think, will accelerate. As you rightly remarked, you know, globalization. Once a company is used to work with some IT people wherever in Siberia, you know, why should you change? You know, maybe the step to go there first is a big step, but once you have done it, you do it again, and then you go to the maybe even lower wage countries. The inflationary. So there's some interesting aspects. So right now we have a little bit of inflation or accelerating prices, but this is really a cost push, right? Lumber, a lot of raw materials just became very expensive. I don't really know why. It seems to be that just there was an aggregate demand thing. Suddenly everybody wanted to construct, and so we see some inflation. Not yet in the not yet in core inflation, we don't see that much there yet, but agricultural products and you know, construction products, there we clearly see something. But this is temporary. You know, lumber will increase 3 times and then it's done, and then it might come back again. So it's not something that lumber increases 3 times, again 3 times, again 3. That's for sustained inflation, you would need something like this. But then the other point, you know, why? So how are governments going to deal with the deficits? They're basically 3 options, right? You can tax more. That's how you can repay, by taxing people. You know, if you want to get re-elected, that's probably a good idea.
Political suicide.
You can save on spending, try to spend less. It's a little bit Kristina's point, that's true. So many people went through the cracks. If it's our duty, the government's duty to provide funds for these people, which basically means more spending. It's politically attractive. You have new voters, because if you give them money, they're going to vote for you. And the third thing is it's about inflation. By inflating, you can actually reduce the real debt, the burden of the debt. Just think about you have a house, you have a mortgage, a nominal mortgage of $1 million. That's what you owe the bank. And if you have a hyperinflation, that $1 million is basically will be your wage you get in a day the next day. That's how you get rid of your debt. So through inflation. The problem is it's not so easy to generate inflation. It's actually very hard. So central banks try and try and try. Since I remember since the last 15 years, every central bank says, we need a little bit more inflation, and they just don't get it.
But when you look at MMT or basically helicopter money and giving away money for everybody, you cannot make stuff up in the sense that you cannot really create out of nothing. My understanding is inflation, if production stays the same, but the monetary mass increases along with velocity, then you have more inflation.
But helicopter money is different. The way that money is produced today is basically balance sheet extension.
Okay.
They just produce this liability, the US dollar. They increase the liability, and then they buy something with its assets. But they have a balance sheet, right? There's the liability on one side and the asset on the other side. So in the US, it's mainly treasury, but in Switzerland, for example, it's real assets, like even stocks and stuff like this in the balance sheet of the central bank. But if you talk about helicopter money, that's very different. Helicopter money will be, you create that money, but you don't buy anything with it. So it doesn't affect your balance sheet. You just, the easiest way to think about it is really put a printing machine on the floor and start printing paper.
So my understanding of helicopter money is to try to stimulate the velocity component of the...
No. This is the basic thing is, how do you produce the money? If you just print it physically and then you hand it over as gift, that's helicopter money.
But is it not that the proportion of the marginal proportion of people to spend that money as they are lower in the class will be higher?
Okay, but now we talk about different things. I was just talking about the mechanism, the two types of mechanism that you can create money.
Right.
Central banks don't use helicopter money. They don't do that. They have balance sheets.
Do you think they will?
No. For example, for the US, it would require a change in the, I think, in the constitution. They are not allowed, even Switzerland wouldn't be allowed to do it. So the parliament would have to give them the right to just print money and, give it out as a helicopter. You drop it down to everybody and spend it. So right now, I don't know about every country, but I think in most countries, this would not be allowed. The central banks are not allowed to do that. But it would be the most efficient way to generate inflation. That would immediately generate inflation, right?
So,
because people think, these central banks, they get crazy. What they do. And the one problem why we don't get inflation, desirable inflation would be like 2% or 3% or something, is because people trusted central banks too much.
Yeah, but again, maybe switching gears a little bit here to get the opinion of Kristina is, you were talking about fundamental rights and the right of people, but I don't feel like everybody feels the same about what those fundamental rights are. When you look at central banks expanding their mandate to maybe climate change and carbon taxes and things like that. What is the solution, in your opinion, to what are the actions that a government can take, or the private sector, along with all the economic players, can take in order to stimulate things in a way so that it doesn't increase the disparities of wealth?
Okay, first of all, I think we sort of like, I might just give a little bit of like international law 101. 101. So first of all, every international legal instrument that relates to human rights, labor rights, anti-trafficking of human beings, anti-smuggling, rescue at sea, all of that, the main, what we call duty bearer, is the state. So the state is the first entity that has the obligation once they sign. And I would just like to underline that those instruments are negotiated outcomes. They did not drop down one day from heaven and surprise everybody. It took like 5-10 years to negotiate them before anybody signs and ratifies. So the state has the obligation, first of all, to not do anything against those rights or those obligations that the state has in those instruments. Then they have to make certain, and one of the things they do is pass legislation so that those border rights are respected on their territory and for everybody who's under their jurisdiction. Now, in this specific setting, one of the entities that will have to, or the many entities that have to obey national legislation is, for instance, investors, companies, be they small, be they big, it doesn't really matter. Up until now, most state legislation has, I think to a great extent, when it came to human rights, for instance, thought that those specific entities were actually covered by, for instance, other legislation on, for instance, you should not evict people without a reason. You cannot fire people without a reason. I mean, labor legislation nationally. And then about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you began to see a rush of legislation on environmental matters. And that sort of had to be invented from scratch. What does it mean to have CO2, zero carbon? How do you count it? What is it? Because up until 5-10 years ago, nobody really cared. So all of a sudden I was like, okay, we need to legislate on this very specifically. On the societal aspects, from most states' point of view, that was not such a legislative priority because most of this adequate salary, places to live, right to food is in many states covered by other legislation that does not specifically target private sector actors. Now there's a realization also with globalization, and you mentioned, for instance, cheap labor elsewhere. You know, there's a realization with globalization that everybody has a supply chain that goes somewhere. Investors either invest abroad or invest in companies that have a supply chain. So then is now a realization that if we want to really further the SDGs, if we want to claim to be ESG, whatever it is, then we also need, from a regulatory perspective, to focus specifically on these actors and what is it that they need to do. So that's why we see, for instance, so much regulation coming out from the EU right now, including on human rights due diligence. And you mentioned, for instance, cheaper labor elsewhere. Yes, of course, there's cheaper labor elsewhere because the living wage elsewhere will be different. But that does not mean that you should exploit because you are elsewhere. At least not if you want to be claimed to be sustainable. At least not if you don't want to operate without a social license, if you want to not get fined. And also, I think to a very great extent, if you don't want to lose your consumers these days, because people are more and more aware of these things. So you can definitely outsource to Gabon, but then you need to say, okay, what is it that you need to pay? And what is it that you need to safeguard in that context? For instance, still to have decent work, decent standard of living, it'll just be cheaper than Switzerland. So you can still save money, but you can still also then have systems in place internally that helps bring people out of poverty, for instance.
Yeah, Kristina, what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, from your intervention is that there is a lot of because as a libertarian sometimes you just hear regulation, so sometimes it scares you, because what I understand is that the COVID-19 is basically triggered a lot of different realizations, but also a lot of different regulations. And this sounds more like centralized planning to me, where the state has, you talked a lot about the state. The state has a bigger role to play. And I see that also because when those measures of locking down businesses happen, the ones who suffered the most were the SMEs, and the bigger companies were the ones who profited the most. So there seems to be a polarization onto who can and who cannot do business, and who is allowed and who is not allowed. And this is basically decided by the state. So I do see a clear trend of statism a lot more than liberalism in that sense. Then the other point, just for the sake of debating perhaps a little bit, is that when we speak about sustainable development, I think it's been historically clear that so far discovered the only sustainable way to develop economies overall is the free market enterprise. So yes, by going to different countries because the labor is cheaper, it can sound like exploitation, but this is actually a good thing for those other countries who benefit from much more employment. I myself, I'm from Mexico. I'm looking at that country as a very productive, a very smart, and very good bang for the buck in a way. And as those evolve, this was the case of Poland before a couple of years ago, wages in Poland have increased. So all in all, you see a cycle of those countries evolving perhaps slowly. Obviously, it's the responsibility of everybody to do things in the correct way for their own benefits. Like you say, a lot of people are increasingly caring about how you operate business. But I mean, as a whole, I don't feel like the state will make necessarily better decisions than the private sector.
But I think my point exactly was that you can go somewhere and pay a much cheaper living wage, but that does not allow you to exploit in that setting. That's exactly my point, is that you can go and you can pay so that people are in that context, developmental context, paid a decent living, so that they can prosper, so that they can send their kids to school.
But who defines that? That's the problem.
No, it's not. I mean,
there is somebody there and says, okay, some
why don't you go and ask somebody who doesn't have enough food, who doesn't have clean water, who can't send their kids to school, what the hell this is all about? Because we sit here really comfortably in Geneva and complain about a lockdown. So, yeah. I mean, let's have a reality check here and think about people around the world, shall we?
I mean, I'm just very skeptical about regulations, maybe like Thierry, because I see this in finance, and financial regulations that we see today are mainly the main driver of the inequality that we see today. I give you another. I mentioned it at the beginning. For example, financial regulation that we have today precludes basically 98% of the people to make profitable investments. They're just not allowed to do it.
Exactly. So perhaps that's something.
So these regulations quite often are just, the insiders in the system are going to, manipulate the legislation to protect them. That's what you will see in terms of these. When you go this regulatory government, everything is the government. Passed down the road. I don't believe that this is going to improve
everything is the government. We're saying the governments right now are considering to do things that actually also puts up regulations for entities that have enormous power over other people's lives. It is not very much different from saying that I'm not allowed to kill anybody. And if I do, something will happen to me. I will be prosecuted. And if it can be proved, I will be put in prison. If I sign a false check. something will happen to me. It's a different form of regulation, but it is a regulation that protects those who have less power. Can it be manipulated?
That's
of course
hopium,
it can
right?
be manipulated. I am not saying I have an abracadabra, let the world be wonderful.
Look,
I wish.
what you say is hopium.
Thank you.
You know, in an ideal world, you know, we would have this nice planner.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's not well.
Aleksander and Kristina, I think I successfully.
The reality is exactly this law. This
I successfully managed to stimulate the debate, and that was the point.
For the insider to profit.
It might also be that if somebody who's actually worked in these countries that might need living wages and seen what the steps are to be taken, perhaps, I don't know, take it in, listen or not. It's like when you speak about helicopter money, I would be like, oh, fascinating. For me, helicopter money is money to buy a helicopter for, but I'm not expressing myself on it for a reason, because I wouldn't have anything to say about it.
So I am smiling because I think I successfully stimulated the debate in that sense. But I think, Kristina, you have a point when you say that not only governments have a role, right? But I think also people are demanding precisely more and more of that government. So it might not come from government itself only, Aleksander. It's also, for better or for worse, also demanded by the people who want government action. So I'm going to take an opportunity here to open the floor also for other questions because I see some coming from the public. And one of those are here we have: what socioeconomic policy is appropriate for the period of slowdown in economic growth during COVID-19? So what is the socioeconomic policy that would solve this, if any? Because I personally would be on the side of Aleksander, I think a little bit better, in the sense that who are the angels who are going to decide what is good and what is not? Are we not better off to leave it to the market? But obviously other people think otherwise, and you know, there might be cumulatively a way to find a solution. The second question here is COVID-19 crisis an opportunity for the shadow economy? Anybody wants to respond to that one? The shadow economy? Aleksander, you're mute.
I think it was the opposite, actually. I mean, in Switzerland, we have a very small shadow economy sector. So say cleaning personnel that is not officially, you know, and stuff. And these were the people that were hit the most by COVID, because everybody else that had a, you know, formal job, at least he got some compensation from the government. He could go unemployment benefits or some other benefits. And so, and in many other countries is what was the same thing. And it was really the shadow economy, the people that, you know, are basically working under the radar. They were hit very hard because they had no compensation, nothing. You know, suddenly you were not allowed to, restaurants were closed, and the restaurant, you know, some of the restaurants only have some personnel in the kitchen that, you know, are a little bit under the radar. They were just fired, they're just gone, they didn't get anything. So I think for the shadow economy, COVID was not really good.
So, I think for shadow economy, I think also the digitalization and the payment increasingly by credit card in the cashless society is some sort of a way to control the flow of money a little bit more there. So it could be also in some forms not stimulating the shadow economy. I think what stimulates the shadow economy is the increasing economic barriers via monitoring of economy. And then I think it assumes also that there is a shadow economy, in the sense that there is things that are allowed and things that are not allowed, but they're not the same in every country, they're not the same in every place. Most of those regulations come from the different government. In some, drugs will be allowed, in some prostitutions will be allowed, in some not. And so in one country will be considered as a shadow economy and in another not. So I think the more you have prohibition, the more you have a shadow economy. I'm not saying I am for everything and anything, but I'm saying that this definition there might apply differently in different places.
But you might want to remember that a lot of people work in a shadow economy and things that are completely legal, such as picking tomatoes.
Absolutely.
That's right. That's right. So, Kristina,
it doesn't have to do with illegality. You know, you can proceed illegal work, but you are in the formal.
So Kristina, I'm curious to know what do you think the socio-economic policy would be appropriate to bootstrap the economy post-COVID?
I'm not an economist, so I prefer to not pronounce myself on things I don't know anything about.
Well, I admire your humble approach. I think.
I just know what I'm really good at, and that's not it.
Well, okay. So maybe if I can twist the question from a legal side, do you think governments have the authority and legitimacy to manage the economy, and do you think lockdowns for businesses are justified?
I don't think that we are taking away the free economy or the free market when we say we need to respect people's labor rights, for instance. Okay. And I don't think we're taking away the possibility to outsource your labor to countries that are cheaper, as long as you still treat people nicely. The government has, according to international standards, the right to protect and the obligation to protect the population largely or against any health, against a pandemic. Did they do it well? Did they not do it well? Was some of them on the limit of what they should perhaps be doing in terms of surveillance? Probably yes.
So maybe switching a little bit to Gary here, since you've been silent for quite some time, I think you probably had some.
I listened to very interesting.
Okay, so when it comes to real estate, I mean, one of the things I think personally, but this is only me, is that for a business, we used to have real estate as part of the balance sheet, as part of our assets. My approach to things is let the real estate people deal with real estate, because they probably know better how to optimize the space there. So about optimization of space, and I know I'm just switching gears here. There is a question here that says, how can real estate investors improve the future of work?
Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, I think investment into real estate has a long history, and there will be a long history, or there will be a big future. And a lot, especially in the current financial environments, where the markets are overflowing with money, and there is a pressure to invest this money into sustainable investments, because a lot of these investments are coming from social engaged funds, and they have to follow the rules and the regulations that exist to protect these monies, the pension fund money and so on. So this means a lot of money, especially from big institutional investors, are going into the real estate sector. And obviously this has an impact on the price, and on the long term, this has also an impact on the yield, on your return on investment. And just looking at Switzerland 5 or 6 years ago, yield in commercial office or properties has been at 5-6%. Today, investors are happy if they achieve 2 point something, maybe 3 point of yield with their investments, and with all the negative rates, they're making a mix of investments. So what does this mean for not conventional real estate investors? It means you have to go into niches. And niches, they can be geographically, but still remembering that the key driver in real estate investments is place, place, and place. So this means you have, if as a private investor or as a small investor, you have to know the market extremely well. And this is having local knowledge, knowing the local regulations and rules, and understanding the demand. So I know a lot of people that did investments into regional cities, and especially in the living aspect, who knew that there was more and more people have been looking for regional, improving regional real estate offers, where the big players didn't want it to go because they didn't understand the market. So it is, it is knowing your market and putting on niches that you can still today to achieve great returns in investments. How can, now going to the question that was asked, how can real estate investors help flexible models? I believe today you have multiple opportunities to invest in real estate. You can buy shares from organizations that are directly invested into real estate, and there are more and more modern forms to participate into real estate investment without taking the risk of buying and managing and operating your own real estate. And so it is the focus on whom you're giving your money. So and most of the bigger organizations, they understand that there will be more flexibility, there will be more need of transparency. And so investment in real estate is long-term. Investment in real estate is helping the trends I described before.
So I think you made a point that is place, because when I am going from one place to the other, and I see where the spaces offices are, they are always in the premium spots, and I think that is something that is very appealing in terms of the accessibility, because I myself, I'm a startup. I would never have had the opportunity to have an office space in those particular locations, for example. And now moving forward, I'm thinking a lot of my employees or the people I interact with are looking for places where, you know, it's at the beach, or it's at very nice locations where they would actually enjoy living, some vacation spots sometimes, and I think that's also somewhat what the future of the economy post-COVID looks like.
Maybe if I can step in, you're absolutely right. So what you have described in our organization, and what you're describing is how we started our business 30 years ago or 35 years ago. When we started our business, we have been focusing on CBD top locations, because there we had the customers that generated the wealth to afford a solution like ours. In the meantime, we have a strategy. If we talk only about Switzerland, today we have 50 locations. We are planning to put 150 locations in place in the next 5 to 10 years. And this means we will go to mountain resorts. We will go to little villages. If we really are serious about reducing commuting, we have to make sure that we have a network that allows people to reduce their commuting. And this means we need to go not only to economic key cities, but also to places where people live, because today they sleep there and they commute. So if I want to offer them professional workspaces in a flexible way, I have to be there and bring up a product that is convenient for them.
So I mentioned just one risk that I see.
Yes.
At the end of so we started also with the discussion about debt. I think debt levels really went up dramatically. And I see a little bit the problem with the real estate investments is that they're a really easy target for taxes. And when countries really get into trouble, we don't see this yet. They are going after you. I'm completely sure. That's, you know, human capital is really, it's kind of more difficult to tax because as we can see, human capital can move. Yeah, I can go to Monaco or I can go there and, you know, I can still do the same work, right? I still might work for Novartis, but if I have a nice house, I'm not going to move that house so easily. I can go, and I really think that will be one of the main targets when governments get into trouble, will be, you know, taxing real estate.
I mean, that's from a taxation point of view, right? I think for the topic about the future of economy as a whole, I think I think flexible space and flexible work is part of it. But then I'm curious to hear the opinion of Kristina. What do you think is also part of the future economy? What do you think is something that we haven't seen before the COVID, that we will see more now? Is it going to be more collaboration between private and public? Is it going to be some sort of different standards on the way people operate? What do you think?
I can see from asset managers that I work with that there is a lot of pressure from the new generation of investors, of asset owners, that they want to see how things are actually, what things are being, money is being invested in, what are the values. There's a lot of, right now there's a lot of blah, blah ESG, but that's a sign that nobody really feels anymore that they can invest or that they can operate without at least claiming the sustainability. And the more transparency we're going to have, the more reporting we're going to have, the more those who are actually not will be found out. And I don't even think it's a question, it's also a question of regulation, but it's a question of consumer pressure. I mean, honestly, I think that people who are my age or younger are really looking in how is the money being invested? What are the values? How are people ensuring that we don't hurt the planet, we don't hurt other people? Not everybody, but I see a true tendency and really see asset managers feeling under huge pressure from the new asset owners.
So as we are wrapping up,
maybe I would like to confirm the point Kristina is doing. This is exactly what we are facing, and there is another element there. There is the whole technology, IoT, and so on, that will enable us to manage and run real estates much more sustainable than it was in the past. And as Kristina mentioned, in the past there was a lot of blah blah, but if I look at the developments that are done, the products that are coming to the market, a lot of this starts to materialize, and a lot of bigger property owners that have real portfolios, they're investing a lot of money in upgrading their old real estate portfolios to achieve these things. This is totally confirmed.
So as we are wrapping up, since we're hitting the end of the time, I'd like to get one last conclusion from everybody in terms of what do you think 5 years from now, looking back at this event of COVID-19, will be the major transformation factor of COVID-19 going forward? Gary?
I think we will find, or we are convinced, and personally I'm convinced that we will find that it was an accelerator. It has changed some of the things, but not all the habits. We are human beings, and it needs more than just a 12 months crisis or 18 months crisis to really change how we act and behave as human beings. I'm a little bit more positive about the death value than Aleksander. I believe, and I think the only way that sustainable will reduce the percentage of the deposit is with ongoing increases in the BIP that is delivered. And so as the productivity is going up and what is generated as BIP will become, the death will become a smaller percentage of the overall, and this will reduce the overall problem and will help. So my belief is that also COVID has been a shaker for a lot of companies and organizations to look at how they did business so far, and they will change to the better. So every crisis has chances, and I think a lot of companies are taking these chances, and it will help to further accelerate growth.
So growing the pie and making the pie better, basically. Kristina, what do you think is going to be?
I have to agree on that. I also think that it's been an accelerator. I don't think that we will have in any way a perfect world in my lifetime, perhaps never. I think though that there is really a tendency now to be more about, it's not enough to have a nice brochure saying that you're SDG whatever and then plop them up like it's a Kandinsky painting, but really say, okay, so these are the goals you work towards. How are you doing it? And I think that generally speaking, there's more global awareness also, for instance, how not having access to vaccines is affecting you. The disparities that, as you mentioned, that's been a focus on it. I think, as Gary, I think it has accelerated things.
Aleksander?
I also think on the micro level, so on the level of firms and households, it was actually, it will be long-term good thing, because it, you know, it basically accelerated digitalizations and stuff, reordering the workflows and stuff like this. I'm a little bit less optimistic on the macro perspective. Just to make a comparison, so the debt levels that we have now in many countries are higher than after the Second World War. Because during the Second World War, there was just, of course, if you're in a war situation, then you don't care. You just, you know, you just go into debt and you produce your weapons, whatever you need. And then you say, I sort it out later on. So we are now, the levels are similar. I think they are even higher now. But what really allowed after the Second World War to recover was the high growth rates, as you mentioned correctly. But you know, it's very easy to have high growth rate if everything is destroyed. You have to construct the entire infrastructure, everything new. Of course, you have these really high growth rates, but where should that growth come from now? I don't see it. It's not going to come. We will, you know, I don't think it's going to be reduced. It's probably like 1%, 2% per year. I mean, I'm talking here about the real growth. And that will be never sufficient to grow out of the debt.
Okay.
I just don't see, you know, I mean, if I agree if you have 10% or 8%.
It's not the gloom and doom, but I tend to agree with you, Aleksander, actually.
Then that's different, yeah.
I think COVID-19 has brought off some...
In Italy, or where do you want to get 10% growth in Italy?
Well, when you start from 0% growth, then it can become negative before it becomes very positive, right? So
I mean, you're talking about real growth, right? I mean,
right. So I guess maybe if COVID has destroyed the economy enough, maybe the growth is going to be back at double digits. But you know,
there will be a bump. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot
But I'm talking about sustainable growth of 10% over a decade, 20 years. That's what we saw after the Second World War. I think one bump. It's a permanent growth for 10 years, 20 years.
To pick up on the word you use, which is war, I think a lot of politicians use that word as well, as if we were fighting a war with an invisible enemy, which was this COVID-19. And I think that is the war that we saw, and perhaps the response will be a reconstruction in a different way with a lot of fiscal spending along the lines of a monetization of that debt. I think the trends is clear. You see Christine Lagarde was at the finance level in France, who's now at the ECB. You saw the president of Italy, who was formerly president of the ECB as well. So there seems to be a revolving door there between the monetarists and the statists, and maybe that's probably a little bit of what we're going to see moving forward. I think a lot of it will be a polarization between those who will want to manage the economy the way they think it's best, for better or for worse. Perhaps the technocrats will have the answer, or perhaps they won't. Is it going to be worse before it gets better? I think there will always be pockets of opportunities if you look at things in one way. Recently I heard some very pessimistic friends of mine saying that people are actually the carbon footprint problem, and that we are the carbon they want to tax, and we are the carbon they want to get rid of. But it could be also that we can just do things in a better way, and therefore perhaps 5 years from now we'll be singing Kumbaya, let's be friends by the fire. But provided everybody does what they think is best, the free competition of ideas and processes is probably what's going to bring the best of us. One last sentence, everybody. Gary, a message you would like to share with the audience? You're in a mute.
Yes, thank you. I think for me the message is we have been going through a crisis, and I really believe that most of the organizations have been working very hard and have been looking at their business models, have been putting their slaves back, and have identified things for improvement, and the ones that will consequently execute and stay on the strategy and take values into consideration in their business models, as mentioned partly by Kristina, they will win. Maybe one little remark regarding the missing growth, and Aleksander, you're absolutely right, but a part of the missing growth is the negative interest rates. There are quite a lot of organizations that benefit from negative interest rate, and this helped to reduce the death as well, if I'm not totally mistaken. Have a great day. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be part on your panel. It was a pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Kristina, one last sentence.
Yes, I think that we need to, as Gary said, think about investing with value, and that it's fine to have return on investment, but you might not necessarily need 20% on return on investment. But also to remember that we had a very privileged panel speaking about something that touches a lot of very unprivileged people, and to perhaps remind ourselves that we are that exactly, very privileged, trying to speak on behalf of somebody else, and that when we make actions, we sort of think about how it impacts others.
Thank you, Kristina. So as we're running late already, I appreciate your time, everybody. Appreciate the audience, and we're going to be continuing exploring the ways to make a better world. Some people have an idea of their better world, and some people have another, but ultimately I'm sure there can be compromises and there can be progress in there. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and hit the bell as well. We will be subsequently sharing the different links to know more about our excellent panelists, and also get more information there. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.